I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. Two men had been scoped out as possible enemies to the prophet, and enemies to some of his deeper teachings, of course, polygamy. We discussed the tribunal of William Judas Law last week, but another person was labeled as a possible traitor to the prophet and the cause of building the kingdom of God. This other person is somebody who's come up before in our timeline, but only tangentially, when his name was mentioned in Revelations or he was called to various leadership positions. However, this man, William Marks, is going to occupy an increasing amount of our timeline moving forward. A few days after the special counsel was called to answer William Judas Law's complaint that Joe was, trying to remove him by use of the Danite police force, William Marks petitioned for a similar hearing, which was answered. We're going to read through the proceedings of William Marks' special counsel as he reveals an even deeper troubling trends in the Nauvoo government system. But first, let's spend a little time getting to know William Brutus Marks. Marks was born in Rutland County, Vermont in 1792. He was 13 years senior to Joseph Smith. He married Rosanna Robinson in May of 1813 at age 20, and they moved to Portage County, New York, when missionaries came knocking on their door. The Marks family was baptized into the church around probably about April of 1835, and William Marks was inducted into the office of priest. He was ordained an elder the following year, after which he moved to Kirtland when the church was amidst considerable turmoil during the Fanny Alger scandal. Clearly, William Marks showed promise in leadership as he was inducted into the High Council of Kirtland in September of 1837, and he was eventually elevated to Kirtland stake president in 1838. When Joe Rigdon and the majority of the Quorum of Apostles had removed to Missouri in order to flee, legal and ecclesiastical consequences for their conduct in Kirtland. Joe instructed William Marks directly to move to Far West to be stake president there, but the plan for the Marks family's move was thwarted as the Missouri Mormon War, the Haun's Mill Massacre, and the arrest of Joe and other leading church officials happened before the Marks family could actually make the move. The Marks family instead moved straight to Quincy, Illinois during the winter of 1838 to 39 as the Mormons were experiencing their third mass exodus. Joe Rigdon, Hiram, and other church leaders escaped from jail in spring of 1839, and they made their way to Quincy to find William Marks doing a fantastic job of helping the Mormons settle there. William Brutus Marks was instrumental in coordinating the settlement of Commerce, Illinois, and changing it from a swampland with a few buildings into a thriving community that came to be known as Nauvoo. William Marks, by special appointment, was named stake president of Commerce on 5th of October 1839, which became the Nauvoo stake in 1841 when the city charter went into effect. And William Marks temperamentally was a very stable guy, which made him very appealing to the Mormons who were amidst a world of turmoil. And stakes, let's back up here. Stakes in Joseph Smith's church are much different than stakes in the church today. The Mormon church today is structured such that very small localities with a few members are called branches. Above the pecking order for branches are wards. Conglomerations of multiple wards and branches are stakes. Today, there are about 3,300 stakes worldwide. However, under Joseph Smith's leadership, there were essentially three different stakes. He had the Kirtland stake, the Missouri stake, and the Nauvoo stake. These were the stakes that tethered the kingdom of God to this terrestrial sphere. So, to be a stake president like William Marks was, meant you were of a select group of extremely high-ranking Mormon leaders. But his leadership roles didn't end there, because William Marks was also named directly in Doctrine and Covenants 124 and specifically told to purchase stock in the Nauvoo House Association. That was the hotel project that Joe started, but never could finish, like most of the projects that he started. William Marks was also in the Nauvoo Legion. He was a regent of the University of Nauvoo. He was one of the earliest members of the Nauvoo Masonic Lodge, and he would be inducted into the Council of 50 when it's organized in March of 1844, which we've already discussed on this show a little bit anyway. William Marks was one of the highest-ranking Mormon elites in Nauvoo. He was also a personal friend of the Smiths and a generally moral person. The guy had his head on straight. Marks had been one of those on the forefront defending Joe against the supposedly slanderous accusations of John C. Reckitt Bennett when his expose letters and book were published back in 1842. From Mormon Enigma, this is the greatest biography of Emmons Smith on page 128, quote, Joseph's followers were tireless in their efforts to clear his name. William Marks, president of the Ecclesiastical Association of several congregations in Nauvoo, termed a stake by the Mormons, published his support of Joseph in August 1842 in The Times and Seasons. Marks attacked John C. Bennett. Now quoting Marks, I believe him to be a vile and wicked, adulterous man who pays no regard to the principles of truth or righteousness. Back to Mormon Enigma. Joseph had not taught the doctrine of plural marriage to Marks. Truthfully, Marks said that he knew of no order in the church which admits to a plurality of wives, and did not, quote, believe that Joseph Smith ever taught such a doctrine, end quote. Well, by late 1843, it was egg on face of William Brutus Marks because he had stuck out his neck to defend Joe against the accusations of Reckitt Bennett, but a year after his public screed, Joe was like, yeah, we're totally doing that plural wives thing that you just said that you didn't believe that we're doing. But thanks for publishing that when you did, buddy. Really appreciate it. Well, when Hiram's psychic Abiff Smith learned about polygamy, Hiram had been in league with William Marks and William Law in opposing it. All three of them had defended Joe publicly against accusations of polygamy in the John C. Reckitt Bennett meltdown. So their own reputations were at stake just as much as all the legal and societal complications that the practice may bring upon this burgeoning sect. Once again, from Mormon Enigma, this is beginning on page 140, quote, within the same few weeks, in the spring of 1843, both Hiram Smith and Emma would accept plural marriage. Hiram, who had disbelieved the rumors that linked Joseph's name with polygamy, had earlier joined with William Marks and William Law in condemning Bennett for his practice of spiritual wifery. They considered the rumors accusing Joseph of such practices to be attempts to blacken his reputation. Hiram was patriarch to the church, Law was Joseph's counselor in the first presidency, and Marks was the Nauvoo stake president. Although the exact sequence of events is not clear, at some point the three became convinced that the rumors were founded in elements of fact. Hiram joined William Marks and William Law to quote-unquote expose Joseph and bring a stop to the practice. Heber C. Kimball learned of the effort and passed on his concerns to William Clayton, who recorded the incident in his diary on May 23rd, end quote. Soon after this interaction, that they learned that the rumors of polygamy may have been founded in elements of fact, Hiram and Bloody Brigham sat on a fence and they chatted about the secret that Joe was keeping from everybody. And the polygamy revelation was dictated a month and a half later. And then the highest leadership bodies of the church were instructed on the practice. The Holy Order was formed to control who knew about the practice and could, had license to, engage in the practice. And then Hiram took his second wife while William Judas Law and William Brutus Marks continued to oppose the practice. Teaching polygamy by reading the revelation to the High Council and Elders Quorum, that was a line-drawing moment. From that time forward, a member of the Mormon leadership they could have heard rumors and simply ignored or dismissed them as slander, right? Before the revelation was actually read in these councils. Or, if you happen to be a guy who was interested in having multiple wives, maybe the allure of this clandestine doctrine that was circulating by rumor that inspired a deeper conviction. But when the doctrine was actually taught and spoke over the pulpit to these small quorums, that removed all doubt. No longer could a member of the highest Mormon leadership ignore the accusations and rumors and consider Reckitt Bennett's exposés completely baseless. So then the question was, were you in or were you out? Those who were in could sleep comfortably in their beds at night while, contemplating how hard it's going to be to tell their wife about the new and everlasting covenant of marriage. Those who are out, well, watch your back, because nobody wants a visit from a Danite. All of this brings us to the hearing that we're discussing today. William Brutus Marks wasn't on board with polygamy and was still smarting from, putting his name out there and defending Joe against the accusations, and all those accusations ending up being true. Marks was concerned his general opposition to Joe's quickly evolving empire would end his own life. A passage from Quinn's second book of the Mormon Hierarchy series, Extensions of Power, illustrates that these fears were well-founded. This is beginning on page 246, quote, "Some LDS leaders have dismissed allegations about blood atonement as misunderstanding or misuse of earlier sermons concerning the atonement of Jesus Christ or the civil necessity of capital punishment. Other Mormon leaders have continued to affirm that after committing certain grievous sins, a person must make sacrifice of his own life to atone, so far as in his power lies for that sin, for the blood of Christ alone, under certain circumstances, will not avail." End quote. What are these certain grievous sins? Number one is shedding innocent blood. Number two is denying the gospel. Luckily for the Mormon leadership, they determine whose blood is innocent, and they determine what the gospel is and what actions constitute denying or opposing it. Early Mormonism was a death cult. There's no other way to put it. Quinn continues, quote, "Some LDS historians have claimed that blood atonement sermons were simply Brigham Young's use of rhetorical devices designed to frighten wayward individuals into conformity with Latter-day Saint principles and to bluff anti-Mormons. Writers often describe these sermons as limited to the religious enthusiasm and frenzy of the Utah Reformation up to 1857. The first problem with such explanations is that official LDS sources show that as early as 1843, Joseph Smith and his counselor Sidney Rigdon advocated decapitation or throat cutting as punishment for various crimes and sins. Moreover, a decade before Utah's Reformation, Brigham Young's private instructions show that he fully expected his trusted associates to kill various persons for violating religious obligations. The LDS Church's official history still quotes Young's words to the brethren in February 1846, now quoting Young, "I should be perfectly willing to see thieves have their throats cut." The following December, he instructed bishops, "When a man is found to be a thief, he will no longer be a thief. Cut his throat and throw him in the river." And Young did not instruct them to ask his permission. End quote. But it wasn't just thieves who deserved an immediate death penalty on the spot. Quote, "A week later, the church president explained to a winter quarters meeting that cutting off the heads of repeated sinners is the law of God and it shall be executed." A rephrase of Young's words later appeared in Hosea Stout's reference to a specific sinner, to cut him off behind the ears according to the law of God in such cases. End quote. That law of God referred to wasn't created by bloody Brigham Young. That was a tool that was crafted by his predecessor, Joseph Smith, and it was simply wielded expertly by this blooming tyrant, bloody Brigham Young. Both William Judas Law and William Brutus Marks were right to be afraid for their lives, as their opposition to Joe's tyranny mounted. The fears that William Marks had came to a head when one night some men decided to lay in wait outside of his home, acting very shady and then building a small fire to keep warm because this was December, and keeping up William and Rosanna all night because the two of them, the Marks family, expected the men outside were actually Danites waiting for the opportunity to blood atone this perceived Brutus before he could strike the Mormon Caesar. So now we have a proper introduction to William Brutus Marks, why he's important to the timeline, and the context for the hearing itself. Now, I could summarize what transpired in this hearing, but I much prefer to let the documents tell their own stories. That's kind of what we do on this podcast. So let's get to the hearing, and we're going to discuss it as we read through it. It begins with a speech from Joe responding to the complaints that Marks and Law thought they were in danger. Of course, Joe plays dumb. Quote, Special session. Object of the council stated by the mayor. Mayor Joseph Smith, of course. Similar to the last council, as William Law and William Marks had considered themselves in danger. When he heard the report, he was unwilling to believe anything about it from the course the thing took in the last council, but for the sake of others, he had called this council. End quote. So now we get to our first player in the hearing today, Leonard Sobey. Leonard Sobey was on his way home when he was stopped by a Danite. This was peculiar, and Sobey thought that he himself might be in danger, but the man instead chose to relay to Leonard Sobey that William Marks and William Law were in danger, and if either Judas or Brutus crossed this guy's path, they were done for. Quote, as Leonard Sobey was going home night before last, he was hailed by a supposed policeman with a gun, which frightened him. Sobey says that a policeman had told him that Marks and Law must not cross his tracks. That Warren Smith said at another time that William Marks and William Law were enemies to Joseph Smith. End quote. Now, Joe responds to these Danites who were on the prowl for Marks and Law by continuing to play dumb. Always remember, this was purely an act, because nothing happened in Nauvoo without Joe knowing about or allowing it to happen. Very few things escaped the notice of his little birds around the city. From Joseph Smith, quote, I have never thought even to dream of doing anything against the peace of the inhabitants of this city. Did not know I had any enemies in this city. I've stayed home and heard but little. Did not know there was so much evil surmising among the people. My long forbearance to my enemies ought to be sufficient testimony of my peaceful disposition toward all men. It occurred to my mind that it was not fear, but got up for effect, but I do not know it. I want the council to investigate this matter. End quote. You see, Joe was at home. He couldn't have sworn a secret oath with these policemen to keep the peace through Danite enforcement rules, right? This is lying, it's grandstanding, it's playing dumb. He wants the special counsel to investigate where all of these accusations came from, because apparently his blanket denials aren't good enough here. His bit about him being home most of the time and therefore unable to orchestrate a conspiracy to kill William Law and William Marks, that's exactly why we have RICO laws for prosecuting organized crime. Right? A crime boss never pulls the trigger himself, but he's responsible for sending people to the catfishes just as much as the guy who actually pulled the trigger. So after Joe's denial here, William Brutus Marks took the stand and reports what Leonard Sobey told him about the conspiracy to kill him and William Judas Law. Quote, William Marks sworn testified that on Monday evening, Brother Sobey came up and said, "Are you aware of the danger you are in?" Marks replied, "No." Sobey says, "Your life is threatened. A policeman stopped me in the dark last night as I was going home. I was alarmed." Marks, "I suppose the threats were from that policeman, but I was mistaken. Another policeman, Warren Smith, said last Sunday that Joseph had enemies, that Law and myself were Joseph's enemies, and if they came in this way, they may be popped over. A fire was kindled in the street near my house, and I thought I was watched." End quote. Popped over into the Mississippi, killed, popped a cap into him. So Sobey told William Brutus Marks that his life was in danger. And then that night, a bunch of guys camped outside Marks's house, which stoked these fears, obviously. So William Marks immediately went and told Francis Higbee, another of Joe's opponents, who actually supposed that his father had died by foul play by the prophet only a year prior to this. And Francis Higbee told William Marks about the conspiracy. And I'm just going to let the document speak for itself. Quote, Francis Higbee told me, and a man in the east part of town told me, and a man came from the other side of the river and told the story to that man as he said. Yesterday morning, Hiram Smith, Wilson Law, and William Law met in the street, and I told the story as before related. End quote. So this is how Marks tried to establish his credibility, right? So Sobey told Marks about the Danite conspiracy, and the night after the guys staked out his house, he went and told Francis Higbee, Hiram's sidekick Abiff Smith, probably a poor choice on that account, as well as William and Wilson Law about what he knew about this conspiracy to kill him and about the guys who were watching him the previous night. So now, Joseph Smith takes a point to question, quote, "Did anybody ever tell you that I directed you to be watched?" William Marks responds, "No," end quote. So, you see, Joe was attempting to establish distance between himself and the conduct of his Danite policemen. Now, Francis Higbee and another man named George W. Krause were actually sent for by the marshal. Krause was a store owner where one of these conversations happened. Krause was also a Danite. The conversation included another dog of Joseph Smith, Warren Smith, who was one of the leaders of the Nauvoo police force and one of the most stalwart Danites within the secret cabal. Quote, "Marshall went for Francis M. Higbee and George W. Krause. Leonard Sobey sworn." Now, Leonard Sobey, of course, is the guy who initially told William Marks, "Hey, you're about to get killed, watch out." Leonard Sobey sworn, quote, "On Sunday, 31st December last, I met Warren Smith in Krause's store, asked him if he knew who the Brutus was. Warren Smith said he believed William Law was one and Marks another. They had better not come in his way. Did not say he would shoot them or endanger their life in any way. Did not know whether there was any private instructions or what. Believed Brother Marks was in danger. Did not think Marks was in danger from Joseph. Thought Warren Smith was under a wrong impression with regard to Marks. Warren Smith said he," meaning Marks, "had better not cross my path when I am on duty. I gathered the idea there was something wrong with Brother Warren Smith. Do not recollect any person present." End quote. So Leonard Sobey bore witness to this exchange in the store of Krause, and he figured that Warren Smith was on the warpath to get rid of Marks and Law by any means necessary because Warren Smith was a Danite and, kind of a bastard of a man like Pistol Pack and Porter Rockwell. But like any good made man in any criminal organization, Warren Smith would never betray the confidence of his boss because he had sworn oaths of secrecy with penalty of death. Quote, from the mayor, "Did Warren Smith or any other policeman give you to understand that I had authorized him to believe there was any difficulty between me and Brother Law or Marks?" Leonard Sobey responds, "No, he did not think Warren Smith would transcend his official duties towards Law or Marks. Felt at the time Marks and Law were in danger. Did not think they were in danger if they did not rise up against the authorities." Did not rise up against the authorities. As long as they keep their mouths shut, they're not going to get blood atoned. Sobey continues, "Did not say he had any instructions. Said to Mr. Marks, 'You have enemies.' My impression was that somebody had been to Joseph to make a bad impression on his mind. Warren Smith did mention Brother Marks' name, I think." End quote. Now, of course, throughout all of this, Joe had plausible deniability because no Danite was going to betray their oaths and tell on the stand what Joe had commanded them to do. Oh, from Joseph Smith's perspective, the air that he was trying to put on anyway was, this is all just a misunderstanding. Quote, 30 policemen, all who were present, sworn, testified that General Smith had never given them any private instruction concerning the case before the council, end quote. Just like with hearing, the hearing that was 2 days prior with William Judas Law, Joe made a grand display with all of the policemen in attendance that they weren't under any secret oaths, right? These men knew exactly what their duty required. It was the first rule of Danite Club. Quote, Warren Smith said Leonard Sobey asked his opinion who was the Judas. I said from rumor I would suspect William Law. Does not believe he mentioned Marks's name. My opinion was founded on rumor. End quote. So as we've seen countless times, when there was a rumor in Nauvoo, it was often founded in a nugget of truth. Now, in all of this, there's a lot of confusion as to who was actually marked as the Brutus or the Judas. Was it William Marks? Was it William Law? Was it possibly both of them? And who exchanged conversations with Warren Smith and Leonard Sobey and George Krause and all of these guys, all of these people who are Danites and had mixed affiliations? Who was actually responsible for leaking the fact that William Law and William Marks were perceived as the Judas and the Brutus in the ranks? So now another guy is introduced, Isaac Hill. Now, from the passage here, Isaac Hill doesn't seem to be a Danite, but he may have just had some insider knowledge about their existence. Now, Hill was loyal, but he wasn't totally on board with polygamy, which, of course, that detail of his testimony was scrubbed from the published history of the church, and it was restored by Dan Vogel's source and text critical edition of the history of the church, from which I'm reading this hearing. Quote, Brother Isaac Hill said Brother Law was in a bad situation, was kicking, and if he did not mind, he would go over the board. Over the board means, he would be removed. He would be killed. If he had his property in available means and was away, he would feel better. Yeah. If he was able to liquidate all of his property and get away from Nauvoo, then he would feel better. And I think everybody can agree with that. Hill continues, have heard it talked of that Brother Law was going to stand. Hill did not tell what he was kicking at. So it seems like Isaac Hill had some intel that, William Law was going to make a stand against polygamy. Now, Hill, this portion, this very small sentence was removed, but it says, I think he mentioned spiritual wife system, etc. That, of course, was removed. It continues in the non-removed portion, I understand a Brutus to mean a treacherous man. And then this last sentence was also removed from the history of the church. Brother Hill did not believe in the spiritual wife system, and Law did not believe in it. End quote. So once again, we see polygamy being scrubbed from the record by small degrees, and the lines that historians draw between celestial marriage and spiritual wifery today are completely arbitrary. They're post hoc and done so with an agenda to scrub Joe's name from any wrongdoing. But once again, this reveals that there were people who were loyal to Joseph Smith who would not speak against polygamy, but just didn't believe the spiritual wife system was good. And that's what Isaac Hill was. He wasn't going to speak out against spiritual wifery. He just wasn't going to believe in it. Therefore, he could toe a line of remaining loyal and not being put on a Danite hit squad list. Whereas Brother Law and Brother Marks, they weren't so smart. Next to the stand is George W. Krause, who was the store owner where this conversation between Leonard Sobey and Warren Smith took place that named William Marks as one of the Brutus. Or as a Brutus, I guess I should say. Quote, George W. Krause, sworn, does not recollect any conversation between Warren Smith and Leonard Sobey at his store relative to the case in question, had a discussion about the duties of policemen. End quote. That's it. That's his whole testimony. As a business owner in Nauvoo, it was best for Krause to just stay out of this, regardless of what he knew or what he saw or what conversations he saw take place. You see, Krause isn't heard from again for the rest of this hearing. He's, whether he said more or whatever, but the point is like lost in the record, as always, is the subtext of the conversation and an exact recounting of everything which was said. Unfortunately, we only have the transcription for Double Dub Phelps, William Wines Phelps, to work with. And he leaves out what led to the next point being made. But the next point that is made harkens to what transpired in the previous hearing. You see, people were generally concerned that the Nauvoo police force were patrolling the street with loaded rifles. It put people on edge. It was an occupying force, and it was too similar to martial law when the Nauvoo Legion would just occasionally occupy the streets. But Nauvoo wasn't in martial law at this time. It had been many times, but it wasn't at this time. So people couldn't see any justification for the police force to constantly walk around with loaded rifles. A resolution was passed at the end of the hearing that we covered last week about William Judas Law, and the policemen were required to hang up their rifles and only patrol with small arms, with pistols. Apparently, that still wasn't good enough, and it even caused more tension, but John Taylor, second prophet of the Utah Church, spoke in favor of this practice. Quote, Counselor John Taylor said it was customary in all cities for policemen to go armed in time of danger. Counselor Orson Hyde confirmed Counselor Taylor's observation. End quote. Cops carrying around guns at this time was something that was not all that common, and it was kind of terrifying. It put everybody on edge. It seemed like it was martial law, but martial law wasn't really in effect. However, John Taylor says that this is a time of danger, therefore the policeman should be justified in walking around armed. What was that danger? Well, it's kind of hard to tell. Next to speak is Hiram sidekick of Biff Smith, and he has a fun little bit of folklore to share. Quote, Counselor Hiram Smith spoke, told a story of the old Dutchman and the ox. Sobey makes me think of an old Dutchman who had an ox, the first animal he ever owned in his life, and he broke him to ride. Then he filled a sack with rocks and laid it on the ox's back and got on himself and told his son to hide by the roadside. And he came along to jump out and hullaboo as he wanted to know how well his ox was broke. The son did accordingly, and the ox was frightened and threw the old man off. "Father," said the son, "I did as you told me." "Yes," said the old man, "but you made too big a boo." End quote. Now, this is an interesting and astute point that Hiram made, but I think it's important to see it from a larger perspective. Who is it that was making too big a boo? Was it Sobey who told Marks that his life was in danger needlessly, or was it Joe who was making too big a boo out of what he perceived to be threats to his criminal empire? Look, a person with such a tenuous grasp on power like Joseph Smith, it's not uncommon for them to overreact to something they see as a dire threat, like William Judas Law going public with an expose about polygamy. Joe didn't learn from this little tale because his reaction to the Nauvoo Expositor, written by William Judas Law, was what actually killed Joseph Smith, right? Joseph Smith didn't go to Carthage jail because of the accusations in the Nauvoo Expositor. He went to the Carthage jail because he committed an act of tyranny and destroyed the printing press. The cover-up was worse than the crime, and he died for the cover-up. Joe was the guy who was making too big a boo when he thought that the ox was tame. The town marshal returned with Francis Higbee, and he was called to the stand to get his side of the story. Now remember, at this time, Higbee was questioning whether or not his own father had been taken out by the Danites. Higbee would be one of the conspirators alongside William Judas Law to publish the Nauvoo Expositor. It was important for Francis Higbee to keep his own thoughts close to his chest, because if he aired out suspicions that Joe was orchestrating hits in Nauvoo, this is the audience who wouldn't listen to his cries, and, Francis Higbee would be food for the Mississippi catfishes before nightfall. Quote, "Francis M. Higbee sworn, having received the impression from rumor that Mr. Law, Mr. Marks, and probably one or two others could not subscribe to all things in the church, read polygamy, and there were some private matters that might make trouble, don't know of anyone being in danger. No one told me the police had received any private instruction, could not tell who he had received these rumors from." End quote. So what this testimony from Francis Higbee reveals is that it was hard for anybody to trust anybody else in this hearing. There were two perceived sides, right? The prophet and his Danites, and those who weren't on the prophet's side. And nobody could be certain where each other was in this diametrically opposed kind of phenomenon, especially when we had people who were playing both sides, like William Judas Law and, Joseph H. Jackson. Jackson, of course, was the guy who was sent to bust Pistolback and Porter out of prison in Missouri. And Jackson was still deeply infiltrated in the leadership while he was actively writing his expose in secret at this time. See, there were people who were double, triple, quadruple agents here, and nobody knew where each other was. So it was hard for anybody to trust anybody else in this hearing. Next to take the stand was William Judas Law, apparently seeking an explanation for why Warren Smith would tell, the crazy Danite would tell Leonard Sobey that if Judas or Brutus crossed Warren's path, that they would be popped over. Quote, "William Law spoke, said he had no personal feeling against Warren Smith. Some 2 or 3 years since he sued Brother Warren and stayed the suit, etc. Was suspicious Warren Smith's feelings might have risen from that source." Yeah, so maybe Warren Smith was just harboring personal animus because William Law had sued him over a property dispute a couple years back, right? That's possible. Or maybe Warren Smith was operating on, special instructions from the prophet, and it just so happened that his special instructions coincided with his deep personal desires to kill William Law. Then after that, it says Counselor Hiram Smith, Daniel Carn, who was responsible as being one of the Danites in last week's episode, Warren Smith, the crazy Danite from this week's episode, and then Leonard Sobey and William Marks addressed the council. And unfortunately, the record doesn't have anything more than this. These guys spoke, and nobody today knows what was said. It's one of the limitations of the document. We don't know what else was there. After William Judas Law spoke and these guys all gave their piece, Joe took another opportunity to speak and to clear his name of any Danite conspiracy, of course, by playing dumb. Then he spoke about the necessity of having a police force in Nauvoo, which was apparently, that was still up in the air for some reason. Quote, "The mayor spoke, said no one had come to him with tales about William Marks to prejudice his mind against him, was totally ignorant of it. I said to Brother Dunham, if any man approached my house with arms or attempted to disturb my house, I wanted the police to take care of that individual, whoever he might be. I repeat the instruction and am perfectly astonished that Brother Law, Marks, or any other man should entertain such an idea. I live above suspicion on this subject from any source whatever. How dare they even think that I am running the Danites?" Those are my words, okay, right? He continues, "I never could bring my feelings to take revenge on my enemies. The city council did not concoct the idea of having a police. The several wards petitioned for a police to protect them against invasion. Wanted citizens to pass the streets at any time of night without molestation. But if the police see a man breaking my house or barn, or anybody's house or barn, tell him to stand and inquire his business. I think it possible that some person has been practicing fraud on Brother Sobey and the police and upon individuals, as the police, according to their instructions, had laid away their guns." End quote. So that last point that Joe made basically claims that there may be some who are imitating the police force and purposefully scaring the good citizens of the city of Nauvoo. The police force was necessary, but of course, having the police force out there normalized the practice of having armed guys walk the street, which meant that a person could walk around with a loaded rifle and simply claim that they were a policeman without any check or balance. But Joe did say that William Brutus Marks was basically overreacting to the whole thing, right? If somebody was camping outside of Joe's house with guns at night, he would call the police over to ask them what's up instead of thinking that there was a conspiracy to take his life, afoot. But the thing is, when the people stalking or staking out your house are corrupt cops who you think are going to kill you, it's kind of tough to call the cops, right? Sensing that there was apprehension about Daniel Carnes and Warren Smith, the two radical Danites who were suspected of plotting to kill Lon Marks, somebody proposed that those two guys, Warren Smith and Daniel Carnes, should be dropped from the police force, quote, lest they scare somebody, end quote. There was some deliberation, and that passage was removed from the published history of the church, but by the end of the hearing, these two guys retained their leadership positions in the Danite police force. Quote, "Propose that Daniel Carnes and Warren Smith be dropped from the police force if the council consents, lest they scare somebody," end quote. But of course, there was also the idea that maybe there were imposters, Danites, who weren't actually members of the police force, who were able to walk around with loaded guns because people were becoming used to the fact that the police just walk around with loaded guns. But then after this, Joe had some explicit instructions to Warren Smith and Daniel Carnes. And of course he did, right? Their actions nearly revealed to the whole council that Joe had a secretive assassination squad. So Joe never missed a beat when it came to invoking the collective trauma of Governor Boggs and the Missouri Mormon War. Although, given the context of this hearing, what he says next almost sounds like an admission that a Danite was the one who pulled the trigger on Boggs. Quote, "Don't guard Brother Marks's house anymore," he's saying this to the police force. "Men must not pervert the power entrusted to them, like ex-Governor Boggs, whose executive oath required him to protect the saints in Missouri, but perverted his power to enforce their extermination from the state. Brother Sobey does not know that it was a policeman who stopped him. Brother Marks does not know that the police kindled the fire before his house. Let the police have canes. Let the citizens pass and repass at all times of night." End quote. Then, after Joe spoke, it was John Taylor's time to speak his piece of Kool-Aid drunk propaganda. Quote, "Counselor Taylor spoke, thought the conclusion drawn up by Brother Sobey that Joseph or somebody was going to get revenged by setting the guard to kill Marks was the most contemptible that could be imagined. And if Brother Sobey had had the respect for Brother Joseph he ought to have had, he could not have formed such a conclusion." End quote. Yes, William Marks and Leonard Sobey relaying an assassination conspiracy to kill Marks, those guys simply don't have enough respect for Brother Joseph and therefore concluded that he wanted him dead. He wanted them dead, the two guys dead, William Marks and William Law. That's just fascinating. They need more respect. Joseph Smith is such a moral and incorruptible human being that imagining he has an assassination squad is the most contemptible thing that could be imagined. You gotta love John Taylor. Good guy, really awesome. So the next portion is quite remarkable, and it's even more remarkable because it was removed. So William Brutus Marks and Francis Higbee, two of the primary dissenters and possible targets of the Danite assassination attempts here, they were dismissed from the special council. Now, the passage simply says that they retired, but I think it's more reasonable that William Marks and Francis Higbee have spoken their pieces, and they were just no longer seen as important to the rest of the council proceedings. Why is that important? Why is the detail that they were retired or, dismissed important? Well, when we read the rest of the document, it seems like everybody kind of left on amicable terms. But when we see that Marks and Higbee were dismissed and they were no longer present for the conclusion of this council, that was held on William Brutus Marks' behalf in the first place because he thought that people were going to assassinate him. When we view it through the lens of what the document actually says, it takes on a much more clandestine and seedy kind of nature. When Joe takes a stand, it's hard to tell if he's gloating or if he's guarded and uncertain. Joe had more reason to be guarded and uncertain in this, but always remember, we're only reading the original document as this was recorded by Double Dub Phelps. So we don't know what was actually said. We don't know what the body language was like. We don't know what the subtext of these conversations was like. And it was censored when it was initially recorded, and it was censored when sections were removed when it was published in the official history of the church. So Joe's speech after Marks and Higbee left leads me to believe that they actually gave much more damning testimony than what the record actually reveals here. Quote, Marks and Higbee retired. Mayer referred, and of course that passage, once again, was removed. Mayer referred to Francis Higbee's testimony, thought Francis Higbee had better stay at home and hold his tongue, lest rumor turn upon him and disclose some private matters which he would prefer to kept hid. Did not believe there was any rumor of the kind afloat, or he could have told some of the names of his informants. Thought the young men of the city had better withdraw from his society and let him stand on his own merits. I by no means consider him the standard of the city. End quote. Leave Francis Higbee to stand on his own merits has a lot of implications. He no longer carries the blessing of the church leadership. This was Francis Higbee's exile, leading to his withdrawal from the church and him colluding with William and Wilson Law to publish the Nauvoo Expositor. Joseph Smith continues. There has been a system of corruption and debauchery which these rumors have grown out of, and the individuals who are the authors of them are those who do not want a police. They want to prowl in the streets at pleasure without interruption. End quote. Okay, so it's not that the people who, put these rumors out there, they were afraid for their lives. It's not that they didn't want a police force. They didn't want the Nauvoo police force because it was so incredibly corrupt and just a bunch of the guys were Danites. Right? Like, the host of this show, Bryce Blake, and I like to have cops, but if I thought that every cop driving around my community wanted to kill me because I do a podcast about Mormonism and call Joseph Smith a monster, I wouldn't want that cop around. And if it's so in the blood, I don't want any of those cops around, right? So as much as this seems like a hearing about the utility of the police force, this hearing was actually a very divisive council. This council and William Judas Law's council on last week's episode, they were really a dividing line being drawn. Whose side are you on? The prophet's side or the dissenter's side? Can Joe trust you in his time of need, or are you going to be a threat which requires being dealt with? Continuing, quote, High policeman spoke. Alderman Orson Spencer spoke, approving the conduct of the police and in objection to dropping the 2 policemen mentioned by the mayor. Councilor Harris said the police were in the hands of the mayor. General Wilson Law spoke. Okay, so after that, the next passage is a really interesting one because it was originally quoted by Double Dub Phelps as General Wilson Law speaking about Joe and him being friends. But the editors of the History of the Church inserted William Law instead of Wilson Law. This makes sense given the content of the speech. William Law thought that Joe was a prophet but was misguided and was kind of a dick. Wilson Law hated Joseph Smith and only grudgingly stayed in town because all of his worldly possessions and his career were wrapped up in the Mormon Empire. So the next speech more likely came from William Judas Law than his brother Wilson Law. Quote, General William Law said, I am Joseph's friend. He has no better friend in the world. I am ready to lay down my life for him. And upon that, the mayor and General William Law shook hands. Yeah. Well, it's understandable. William Law was fearing for his life. The next passage was removed, but it says, High policeman said the fire was kindled before Mark's home by some men from the north part of the city and not the policeman. End quote. So now, after Marks and Francis Higbee were dismissed, they were no longer present, the truth comes out, but without any details. The guys who camped out of Mark's house were staking out his house, maybe spying on him, maybe waiting for him to, have his guard down and take him out of his house at night. Who knows what the plan was? Those guys who camped out were from up north, and they weren't policemen. But what did that mean? How far north? Because the north end of town is the hill where all the most wealthy members lived next to the temple that was under construction. The wealthy markets and stores, they were up on the high side of town, up on the hill overlooking the valley that joins with the Mississippi. But much further north on the Mississippi River towards Fort Madison is where the river rats lived. The river rats were basically the Mississippi pirates who robbed and plundered under the cover of nightfall, and then they would just disappear in canoes up the river. If any of them were caught or arrested, they were Joseph Smith cronies, the Nauvoo municipal court system would simply let them walk. The river rats operated with Joe's blessing as long as they only took the property of people that Joe perceived as deserving of being stolen from. For example, the hearing last week when Joe was mad because Norton was running a pot farm instead of investing in the Joseph Smith Translation Bible Project, Norton's hemp farm was problematic because, quote, the Lord had not blessed him in the business, but sunk their hemp in the Mississippi River, end quote. That was probably the Danite river rats who worked under the cover of night and threw his pot farm into the Mississippi, right? So if it were the river rats who were actually camped outside of William Brutus Mark's house that night and set the fire, he should be terrified. If they weren't policemen, he should be terrified. If they were policemen, they could be Danites and he should be terrified. There's no circumstance where somebody who was opposed to Joseph Smith, like William Brutus Marks was, should feel safe at night when there are people camped outside your house. Now, the thing is like there are a few ways to interpret that passage, and the fact that it was removed, I think, says volumes about the honesty or lack thereof of the compilers of the History of the Church. But there are so many ways to interpret it, and I'm not sure what is the most reasonable way. The next 2 passages were also removed from the History of the Church. Quote, General Law spoke again and expressed of his good feelings. Counselor William Wymans Phelps said, policemen have always had to learn their duty. He hoped no one would get up another tempest in a teapot, end quote. Tempest in a teapot is such a great turn of phrase. I disagree that this situation was really blowing things out of proportion. It seems more like people were complaining that, hey, there's a tempest that's about to run through Nauvoo, and the leadership was just telling them to quit overreacting. But let's be very clear. It was Joe's corruption that killed him here. It was the tempest that he made that killed him. These 2 hearings that we see are symptoms of that problem of corruption in Nauvoo. Joe didn't die because he was a prophet. He was assassinated because he was one of the most corrupt men in American politics at the time. Continuing, quote, Counselor Hiram Smith apologized. with no further notes. The ordinance concerning the 40 policemen read twice, meaning that they should not carry rifles, but they should instead carry pistols. The mayor objected to assuming the entire disposal of the police beyond the definition of the ordinance. Councillor Taylor, through the difficulties with Warren Smith and Daniel Carnes, was of a private nature and did not belong to the council, end quote. So, unfortunately, one of those breakdowns, Phelps didn't recount. Phelps never wrote down what was actually transpired, what John Taylor actually said here. So we just don't know. We don't know what Hiram Smith apologized about. We don't know what John Taylor said about the problem with William Smith and Daniel Carnes. Maybe they were a little bit too cavalier with being Danites and, embracing blood atonement. It's just, there's no way to know. But, once again, those passages were also removed. This was a private matter with these guys. Why would somebody like William Marks be afraid for his life, right? Why would somebody who sees the way that this council is transpiring and the way that all of these people are covering up for Joe and Joe's playing dumb and they're totally playing along with it, why would he be afraid for his life? You see, this is precisely why we have the due process of law and why it's supposed to exist, because sometimes people like Joseph Smith, a demagogue and a tyrant, push the system to the point of breaking. Joseph Smith didn't operate by the set of rules and ethics most of us follow. We saw last week that there were different systems of law which people in Nauvoo followed. There was law, then there was the law of the Lord. And the law of the Lord was whatever Joe wanted it to be. He was a king in a nation with no kings. People don't look kindly upon tyrants. Continuing quote. Alderman George A. Smith said he could sleep with a fire near his house if there was some of the police warming themselves by it, and he believed an honest man could do the same, end quote. So clearly, George A. Smith is, impeaching the character of William Marks, the initial complaint being that there was guys who were staking out his house who had a fire near his house last night. George A. Smith is impeaching his character, saying that only an honest man would, only a dishonest man would be afraid of policemen warming themselves outside of his house at night. And then he is also trivializing the issue. Either that or he completely misunderstands why William Marks was afraid in the first place. But my general point is you can't ever trust anything that George A. Smith says to be intellectually honest. But, of course, that passage was retained. Continuing. On motion of William Wines Phelps, voted that the two policemen be retained, Warren Smith and Daniel Carnes. The police received the thanks of the council. Brother Sobey said, Warren Smith did not say he would pop a hole through him, did not say anyone would pop a hole through him. He never heard such a thing, end quote. Now, this final statement at the very end of the council was obviously Leonard Sobey. He was reading the room. He understood that he didn't have any friends here in the council. His denials of what he had stated earlier simply shows that he knew that the council was coming to a close and that this battle for truth was lost, that corruption ruled the day. Final 2 points. The cross-examination and speeches are generally omitted, and council adjourned at dusk for the want of candles, end quote. It's such a fascinating special counsel. The reasons we spent so much time on, just these two hearings in early January 1844 was because they reveal exactly how corruption flourishes in the darkness. There was absolutely no watchdog, no independent oversight, no, watchman on the tower. There was no check and balance. There was no democratic process. Joseph Smith was anointed king over all of Israel, and king is the most fitting term. The king can do no wrong. In many ways, we're lucky that Joe called William Marks and William Law a Brutus or a Judas at his right hand, because the nicknames fit perfectly for both of these guys, right? From William Law's perspective, he did betray Joseph Smith by publishing the Nauvoo Expositor. This showed to the world, like kissing Jesus on the cheek, the powers that Joe had, and really everything that people already expected of Joe or suspected of him. He was a tyrant and he needed to be stopped. William Judas Law, publishing the Nauvoo Expositor was the greatest betrayal in Joe's life from his own right-hand man and one of the most powerful men in Nauvoo at the time, and it was the inciting incident of his death in Carthage. But what about William Brutus Marks? Why is Brutus the fitting name for him to wear in our historical timeline? Well, William Marks's betrayal of Joe didn't happen immediately at his death. Instead, William Marks was a well-liked guy in high leadership positions in the church during the schism crisis, and because he was a stable and well-liked guy, he held a lot of sway with the general Mormon public. His stability was very appealing to thousands of people whose lives were in turmoil, who faced some hard decisions. Which prophet do you follow? William Brutus Marks, was one of the primary opponents to polygamy, as Bloody Brigham and the Quorum of Apostles began absorbing power through the second half of 1844. In the greatest backstab to Joseph Smith's legacy, William Brutus Marks refused to align with Bloody Brigham and the Quorum of Apostles, instead publicly declaring that Hinchman Sidney Rigdon was the rightful guardian of the church until Joseph Smith III came of age. By mid-1846, William Brutus Marks twisted the knife already placed in the back of Joseph Smith's polygamous legacy by joining James Strang's movement and being named counselor to the president, James Strang. This move dragged a lot of Mormons with him to follow James Strang as Rigdon became increasingly irrelevant in late 1846 and early 1847. So from the believing Salt Lake City Mormon perspective, William Marks truly was a Brutus who betrayed the polygamous legacy of Joseph Smith. After Strang's assassination in 1856, William Marks became a central figure for the reorganization. He was a devoted friend to Emma and to Joe 3.0, Joseph Smith III. William Brutus Marks was ordained a counselor in the RLDS Church presidency in April of 1863. So if the Utah church was what Joe envisioned and strived for his entire life, William Marks was the man to drive the dagger into the back of the Mormon colossus. While he didn't succeed in killing the demon, he weakened it. His fealty and legacy are a source of debate, but the point remains that Joe was right to be skeptical of Brutus Marks's loyalty to him in early 1844. And given Joe's penchant for either running from his problems or making his problems go away through brute force, William Marks was also right to be afraid for his life. Anybody with Marks's social standing and moral compass was a grave threat to the Mormon theocratic empire. Joe dealt with threats, and Marks fits the categories of those who deserved blood atonement. He certainly had denied the fullness of the gospel, and shedding his blood was no problem, because William Brutus Marks was no longer innocent. That's going to do it for our main segment today. We have some new patrons to thank. Looks like we have new pledges on patreon.com/Naked Mormonism from Zig Smash, which is a wonderful, wonderful name. And that's the audio editor. I don't know why. I mean, because I pay him to edit the show, and now he signed up to support the show. But hey, you know what? Hey, I'm totally cool with it. We also have a pledge from Timothy, from Dave and Shay, and we also have a positive pledge edit from Roy. Roy, who's somebody I have met at John Whitmer a couple times in Mormon history conferences, somebody who I've shared many fantastic conversations with. So that means we are now at positive 3 patrons and a total of $11 per episode from the last recording from last week. Y'all stepped up to the plate. Thank you so much for pledging to support the show at patreon.com/Naked Mormonism and giving your hard-earned money to this research and information dissemination endeavor. people who pledge to support the show on that Naked Mormonism Patreon page also get access to a bunch of extra content, including extended, let's say not safe for work editions of each episode or each new episode, as well as an extra episode every week. And we are reading right now on those Patreon exclusive episodes. We're reading through our Nemo Book Club, Mormonism Unveiled, the first so-called anti-Mormon book that was ever published. And it's a fantastic read. It's so much fun. So if you want access to all that extra content and you want to join the Nemo family, please feel free to jump on over to patreon.com/nakedmormonism and join up with the ranks. But if you can't do that, hey, you know what? You're still tuned in. You still hit the download button and you still listen to the end of the episode. And I want to thank you so much for lending me your ear. Hope to talk at you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager, Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer, and Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres in the Opening Arguments podcast as legal counsel. Music is written and performed by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.com and used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2019, all rights reserved.